I'm Kate Winkler Dawson.
And I'm Paul Holes.
This is Buried Bones.
Hey, Paul, have you been thinking about this case all week? You love a good serial killer case, I know.
I actually have. I mean, this is a fascinating case.
Yeah, it is. Well, let me go ahead and do a quick summary so we can get back into it. So we have a story that's set in 1971, California, in Yuba City. And there are a series of men who have been found brutally murdered with, it looks like a meat cleaver knife. I mean, it seems like it's cutting devices, beaten, just in terrible shape. And they've been found in what I describe as shallow graves, but you say is pretty impressive, 6 foot by 2 to 3 feet deep.
Yeah.
And they're in orchards. And they're almost all exclusively transients, people who work on the orchards, people who don't have families that are following up if they go missing. And so far, we have these bodies found in 2 different orchards. And the consistency is the brutality of the way they were killed, that they are transients. They're all white men. They all seem to be sort of the same age range. I mean, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, there's some interesting characteristics that you've picked up on. So do you want to talk about that? Where we've got 12 victims, 1 assault that happened a year before that will be key for us. But do you want to talk about some of the special circumstances around here that are making you come to a particular conclusion so far?
Well, I think when you take a look at all 12 cases of homicide, the victimology is the same. You know, you have white males. They all appear to be older. These are not, teenage boys or younger adults that are being killed. These white males are generally transient. They don't appear to have any real financial assets. So, robbery, financial gain as a matter of committing these crimes does not appear to be the offender's motive. The offender is specifically utilizing orchards to dispose of the bodies, which is interesting because there could be many places, that the offender could go that are much more remote, probably even easier to dispose of the bodies. So there's something about the orchards that the offender is comfortable with, or maybe he's sending a message, whatever it is. The way all of these victims are killed appears to be reasonably consistent from one case to another. A knife or other sharp-edged weapon, such as a meat cleaver, has been used in each instance. There's some beating, there's some bludgeoning. There's also, at least in one case you mentioned, there was strangulation. Mm-hmm. It all appears to be within the same range of violence inflicted on these victims. The victims' bodies are being disposed of in grave sites. And, these are not what I would classify as the typical shallow grave. Mm-hmm. When you say that these grave sites are 3 feet or 3.5 feet down, the offender is having to dig that. That takes time. That's a lot of earth to move. And I don't know how compact the soil is in these locations, but in my experience is that, once you get down 18 inches, it becomes harder and harder because the dirt becomes so compact. Mm-hmm. Most offenders give up after about 18 inches. In at least one case, there is evidence that the victim had been killed on the orchard. There's, a bloody area that the offender had tried to cover up. And then there was what I imagine was either a dragged or dripped blood trail that went 15 yards over to the gravesite. And though the other cases don't seem to have that evidence, that doesn't mean that the offender didn't do that. He may have just been better at covering up what I would call the homicide scene versus the body disposal location. Mm-hmm. So the pattern is consistent. Some of these victims are showing their clothing, lower body clothing, their genital area being exposed. This is where I'm keying in on, okay, there's a sexual motivation to these crimes, even though some of the victims are fully clothed. But I've talked multiple times about how offenders either will redress their victims or allow the victims to redress before they're killed. And then in the very first case of homicide, you have whether it be a pamphlet or some sort of document that the detective described as homosexual literature. So, I'm still not sure what to make of that. Is this something that the offender planted, or is this something that that particular victim had? And maybe there was a solicitation that occurred and the offender is a serial predator, or the offender is sending a message if the offender is planting that type of literature. But I think it goes without saying, this offender is male. This offender is attacking other males. There's a sexual component to these homicides. There's no financial motivation. And all the homicide victims that have been discovered to date are white males.
Well, let's talk about the one victim who isn't white, and he's the survivor and not someone who's been buried, of course, on an orchard. And I just want to remind everybody of the details, because this assault that happens at this bar, cafe, restaurant is something that's really key here. So we now go back to 1970, where that attack happened to Jose. And, he barely survives. It happens in a bathroom. It's owned by a man. This cafe is owned by a man named Natividad Corona. And it sounds like Natividad is the one who called in the tip, because according to him, the person who attacked this man, Jose, in the bathroom was Natividad's half-brother, whose name was Juan Corona. So he's 36 years old. He's from Mexico originally. And he is very, very unstable, according to his brother. So the sequence of events is that Natividad has always been sort of wary of him, even though he said, you can come live with me or live in the area where I am. I can give you work. He's been supportive. But in 1955, so this is 16 years ago, Natividad petitioned for Juan to be committed to a state mental hospital. And here's why. After a flood that had drowned 38 people in Sutter County that year, Natividad said that Juan became paranoid and he became delusional. Juan believed that all people in the county had died in this flood, and they were basically coming back as zombies walking the streets. And he reacted violently, and he was having, fits of rage. And so in 56, he was committed to the DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. Now, before we get into that, so let me get your reaction here. So Juan is the man who nearly killed this man, Jose, a year earlier. And we'll find out more about Juan. And as you can guess, yes, he has access to all of this property where these migrant workers are. Now, the thought is, it's not necessarily who did it, because I think it's pretty clear it's Juan. It's why and what do we believe? Because you've come up with what I think is a very fair, safe assessment of the motivations of this killer, sexual in motivation. Obviously, it's not robbery. It's some kind of gratification. But Juan's family and Juan and his defense attorneys are going to say, that's not it. It's completely different. So that's, I think, where we're headed. But tell me what you think so far.
Okay, well, it's interesting because I am aware of the Juan Corona case. Mm-hmm. I never paid attention to it. I know the lab that I used to work for out of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office, they either did some work on the Corona case or had consulted on the Corona case way back when, mm-hmm. right? When this thing was happening, when bodies were being recovered. Interesting. Going back to Jose's attack, and Natividad is saying that it was Juan that did the attack. Juan Corona did the attack on Jose mm-hmm. in the men's restroom. it's interesting, and you have provided the detail that I guess rumors had it that Natividad was homosexual.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I wonder if Natividad permitted certain homosexual activities to occur amongst men in the restroom at that restaurant. Back in the day, I've got, at least 2 vice operations that were focused in on men's restrooms because that was sort of the hookup locations. And so I'm kind of extrapolating backwards in time, if you will, in terms of where men could engage in sexual activity with other men. Mm-hmm. And is there something that happened between Jose and Natividad that Juan took exception to? Or did Juan approach Jose, whether it was out in the restaurant or he followed him back into the restroom, and then things went sideways. And then obviously, if Juan's the offender in that case, which sounds like he is, he's armed, and that may just be part of him. I think part of it is, when did Juan come into the country? He may have other cases down in Mexico, and I've seen this, where you have serial predators that come up into the country and they just continue committing the same crimes they were doing down in Mexico. But authorities up in the United States have no idea, that these guys are serial predators. So that's, one of the thoughts that I have. And then you get into the psychiatric assessment, where now Natividad is indicating that after this flood, Sutter County, 38 people killed, that Juan became paranoid and violent. And, generally this would be indicative of what I would call the psychotic offender. And the psychotic offender is truly mentally ill. And for whatever their mindset is, they are resorting to violence. And the most notable example I can give is the vampire killer out of Sacramento, Richard Trenton Chase. Truly a psychotic offender. And it's a horrific series of crimes that he committed. The problem that I'm running into is the crimes in the orchards. Mm-hmm. There is an organized element to these crimes. They are pre-planned. The offender is covering up for his crimes. He's burying the bodies. Mm-hmm. He's purposefully selecting victims that really aren't going to be missed. Nobody's going to report them. He is showing a level of mental acuity that I would not attribute to a psychotic offender. Mm-hmm. So I call into question Natividad's assessment of his half-brother. He's not an expert. This is where I'd want a true forensic psychiatrist doing an assessment of Juan to determine, is there a mental issue there? He sounds like an organized serial predator that is completely aware of right versus wrong and is committing crimes that he wants to commit.
We have several routes to go, and you tell me what's the most efficient way. I can skip down into details from the trial that explains Natividad's activities. If that feeds at all into some sort of, anti-homosexual rage or whatever that would be. But, he is not simply a gay man. There's other stuff that happens. In 1953, when Juan was 18, then he immigrated illegally from Mexico to California. So when you were asking about Mexico, is there anything happening back in Mexico? He was 18. So, when he came to California.
Sure.
And he followed Natividad. They were very close. We also have more bodies. I will tell you a total of 25.
Okay.
And we also have sort of the way he was busted to begin with. He has a wife and kids. So there's a lot of different ways. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you started out by saying Natividad's activities.
Mm-hmm.
What I am wondering, with Natividad being rumored to be a gay male, is Juan attacking men in that sort of that mission-oriented type of predator for whatever reason. He's taken exception to, Natividad's activities. But we also don't know about Juan and his sexual preferences. It sounds like, based on the state address, and in 1971, they probably did not process these male victims' bodies adequately for, sexual evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like there was sexual interactions between Juan and at least some of these male victims. But how does Natividad's activities play into Juan's killings? That is what I don't know. I don't understand.
Yeah, let's stick with Juan and how he ends up getting caught and all of that. So it sounds like his brother had called and tipped off the police. And, as I said, his brother had committed him in 1956. So Juan followed Natividad here in 1953 when he was 18. So in 1956, Natividad has him committed. He went to the DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, and he was giving Thorazine and shock treatment until he was, quote unquote, cured.
It didn't work.
Well, obviously not. It sounds like it pissed him off even more.
Thorazine is basically a sedative, and of course you see these electroshock treatments, basically barbaric types of treatments for people that are suffering from mental health issues within these types of settings. I've heard of the DeWitt State Hospital. I'm not sure it still exists, but I mean, we are talking, this is now 15 years before these cases there in Yuba.
Yep.
And you have Natividad is the one that is basically saying Juan has got mental issues, and the state takes him in and then starts giving him these treatments.
Right.
This is where, what type of professional evaluation had actually occurred on Juan during this time frame. And how old is Juan at this point? Is he in his early 20s?
He is 21 when he's committed to DeWitt.
On one hand, there, the paranoia aspect, this is where I start wondering, is he starting to develop schizophrenia, which early 20s is when you start to see some of those types of symptoms. I just have trouble resolving somebody who is suffering from schizophrenia, and then 15 years later is what I would consider a very organized offender. That's where I'm questioning the early assessment of Juan's mental health.
Well, and let me tell you about the next 15 years. So he gets out in 1956. He got out the same year that he was committed. After his release, he seems to get it together. He became a licensed labor contractor. He was hiring mostly Mexican migrant laborers to staff all of these orchards and farms. And some of these workers had been hired to tend to the peach orchard, right? So, Juan has access, obviously. And he also contracted labor for Sullivan Ranch. And for that job, he drove a 1971 Chevrolet panel van, yellowish color, as we suspected.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, I will tell you, of course, they say it matched the mold, the track mold. It's sort of a moot point at this point. Okay. Right. So they think that they have enough information to charge Juan Corona with at least one of these crimes. So they surprise him early morning, May 26th. So the first body was discovered on the 19th. So this is pretty quick. This is 7 days. They find 27 items. They grab him, find 27 items there. 2-foot rusty crowbar with some possible blood stains, a pothole digger with possible blood stains, mud and hair on digging portion, 2 pairs of men's shorts in a leather bag, one with blood stains, 2.5-foot wooden club with possible blood stains. There was an axe, a hatchet, a hoe, 3 butcher knives, a meat cleaver, and a bolo machete. God, I mean, this is beyond a kill kit. They also take 6 9mm Luger shells, some business papers, check stubs, a checkbook, and a ledger. And the ledger, they said, will become known as the murder book, which I think we'll hear more about in trial.
Okay.
So they impounded the van as well as an Impala sedan. They find red hair in the trunk, black belt, and 2 throw rugs. And they find red stains that they think could be blood, 1 sample of a red stain from the rear of the van. They confiscate rubber boots from the van. And I think the red hair is significant just because it doesn't belong in their car, it sounds like. And they're trying to connect all of these victims. At the Sullivan Ranch, they confiscate 2 knives. One is an 8-inch blade stamped Tennessee toothpick, has blood stains on the guard. And then the last inch of the blade has 2 hooks that are designed to tear the bottom of a wound. Have you heard of that before?
2
hooks.
Hooks.
So there's a 1 8-inch blade stamped Tennessee toothpick.
Okay.
And then the last inch of that blade, though, has 2 hooks that are designed to tear the bottom of a wound.
Oh, okay. So what I'm envisioning is you have a blade and then you have sort of these ancillary hooks at the base of the blade. So if you stab that knife all the way in, let's say you're hunting or you're committing a homicide, if you get that knife blade down in there, you're able to maybe even twist the knife, and then those hooks are going to grab the margins, and you're in essence doing more damage to the wound itself, maybe to increase the lethality of that stab.
That's awful. And then moving on, there's a hunting knife and there's also a 9mm Browning automatic pistol. Everything has blood on it. Now, we haven't heard about anybody being shot yet, but it's all covered in blood. So he gets arrested, of course.
I would say, contrary to my initial assessment, the fact that he's got all of this stuff, all this evidence in his possession or under his control in some capacity, it's bloody. He's not getting rid of it. He's not hiding it. It can be easily traced back to him. That, in my mind, is, suggestive of somebody that's really not thinking everything through. Mm-hmm. And this is where I kind of go, technically it's now an antiquated model that the FBI's original behavioral analysis unit used to use, but the organized versus the disorganized offender. Mm-hmm. And, your truly psychotic offender, like a Richard Trenton Chase, is disorganized. He's not even trying to do any type of self-preservation. He's just wandering around and killing people. An organized offender is somebody like a Ted Bundy, who is trying to commit crimes, is planning the crimes, is getting away with the crimes, is covering up, trying to, keep offending and not getting caught. I would say that Juan Corona is demonstrating what's considered mixed. He's got some disorganized aspects, all these bloody weapons and other items of physical evidence that he's not getting rid of or trying to hide or anything. But then he is showing a level of planning as well as, trying to cover his tracks, in terms of victim selection and disposal of the victims' bodies, etc. So he's probably falling into this mixed offender category.
Well, when he's arrested, his defense attorney arranges for him to be examined by this psychiatrist who's from Los Altos, and his name is Dr. Joseph Canton. He says that Juan Corona has continued to hallucinate. And he says that Juan has schizoid personality disorder. And other psychiatrists say that he has psychosis, schizophrenia, and paranoia. So that's the defense. And then, of course, the prosecutor has a whole other idea.
With other cases, you have a true psychotic offender. And I use the term psychotic, indicating there is a real and significant mental illness going on, where now you have a defense of insanity. This person does not know right from wrong. Those types of individuals, when they commit crimes, it's very obvious. They are completely out of it. There is no attempt to cover up their tracks. That's not what we're seeing with Juan Corona. That's where I'm having a problem with that type of assessment. I think Corona knows right from wrong. Why is he burying the bodies? Because he wants to hide what he has done. He knows it's wrong. I don't doubt that there's a level of some mental health aspects, but he is not on the order of a truly disorganized psychotic offender.
Well, let's see what the defense has to say. First, we do have some more information from the field because they're, of course, continuing to search. There's another tip back on the first ranch, the Peach Ranch, and they had seen Juan Corona around this area. Of course, he was there, I'm sure, all the time because he's hiring workers, but they had actually seen him near the peach tree orchard around 10 o'clock one night in January of 71. And, this is maybe really specifically kind of scoping out stuff, but also we have so many bodies, total of 25. I told you that we don't even know when he would have started this. So that might have been the first night. We don't know. They find 2 more graves belonging to a 55-year-old man and a 54-year-old man in the northern part of the peach tree orchards. One of the 2 men, his body is buried with scattered trash, grass clippings, fabric, broken mirror, child stocking, glass holders, anything like that. And then there are, now, Paul, one last thing. There are bank deposit slips addressed to Juan Corona in this man's grave that they find June 4th. So he's carrying around the pot and they fall out, or?
All right. So these are Juan Corona's, it's his bank account.
Bank deposit slips.
Yeah.
That could be an accident.
Well, that would be my first thought, because, you throw a body in the trunk of a, Chevy van, or I shouldn't say trunk, but the back of a Chevy van. You pull the body out, the body's been bleeding, you have things stuck to the bloody aspects of the body, and those things could be bank deposit slips that I imagine Juan Corona is not the neatest individual, and the back of this van probably looked like a junkyard. So, he's probably completely unaware that he's leaving, basically his ID card, I'm the killer, with this body. I guess, there's a long shot chance that he purposefully left those sort of as a taunt. You'll never catch me. But you basically just made law enforcement's job very easy by having your name and bank account with the body. So I don't know. I think it's more accidental.
It sounds accidental because he actually seemed to have done a decent job covering it up. It was lucky that they found this shallow grave to begin with on the first one, and it just sort of went one to the other. But he's going to be charged with first-degree murder for 25 murders, and who knows how many others there are out there. So the trial starts September 11th, 1972. So listen to this. I hadn't heard this before. So he is with a defense attorney named Richard Hawk, who is really well known, and he gets the public defender booted out, and he steps in exchange for Hawk, the defense attorney, being given exclusive literary and dramatic rights to Juan Corona's story. So he gets a kick-ass lawyer, but, he's selling all of his rights, which I'm sure at that point, Juan was going, you can do whatever you want. They move the trial because Richard Hawk, the defense attorney, says there's a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment in Yuba City. So it goes to Fairfield, California, which is 75 miles away.
I know Fairfield very well.
There you go. Well, I imagine you know most of those places very well. There you go.
I lived in Fairfield at one point.
Did you?
And the town I lived in, Vacaville, is a twin city to Fairfield. I was in Fairfield all the time.
Oh, well, then I don't know if it's the same courthouse, but he was there.
It would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this seems like an open and shut case. It does to you and I. But the prosecutor has made a lot of missteps, unfortunately. The biggest issue is that all the evidence going into trial is circumstantial in nature, but they do not test the blood on any of Corona's knives for a match with any of the victims, even a blood typing match. They don't do any of that. So he could have said, I killed all kinds of animals. What are you going to do about it? And they didn't find things with him that were souvenirs, I don't think, of the victims or whatever. So there was an issue there. And that's when the prosecutor's starting to get nervous. They also don't turn in some reports to the defense. And, that becomes a problem. There are a lot of mix-ups. They're having a really hard problem. And I had to talk to Allison, the researcher, about this because it was confusing to both of us. So everybody is mislabeling these victims. We have several John Does, and they can't figure out, should we be labeling them in the order that they were found or the order that we think they were killed, the circumstances, or the different orchards. So even though that seems kind of stupid and silly with a jury or with a judge, it's problematic because it looks so haphazard and it's confusing to people.
The DA is going to charge murder in those cases that they feel that they can prove murder. And so you have all these victims. And so the question that I would be wondering, because I know nothing about how they proceeded with prosecution, is that did they charge all, 25, 26?
25 with first-degree murder.
So they have 25 first-degree murder charges, but these cases all have a spectrum of evidence from probably none to significant, like a bank deposit with Juan Corona's name and bank account on there. Maybe there was a misstep on the prosecutor's office going, well, we know that he did all of these, but the problem is that each murder has to stand by itself. Mm-hmm. And that may be where when you charge a very, very weak murder case in a series like this, well, that gives the defense an opening. And if they can, basically undo the jurors' confidence that Juan was involved in, let's say, John Doe number 2, then they can make an argument. Well, hell, can we trust the prosecution and what they're presenting in these other cases?
Well, this is, for lack of a better term, a complete fuck up from beginning to end. You're right. They have so much evidence. 25, I guess if you want to be specific, different crime scenes, all these different graves, they mix everything up. They remove the fingertips as part of biological evidence from, I don't know if it's all the victims, but several of them. They totally screw that up. They can't figure out what fingertips go with what body at this point. Oh. They lose, I know, so it gets worse. They lose the cast of the tracks taken near the first grave site. Remember, it was, truck tracks, which to me is not make or break, but it's indicative of how sloppy this is. And it's not going to look good for a judge and jury. They mislabel all like foot shoe prints, sewer impressions. They mislabel those casts. The forensic details, once they're brought into the case, don't seem particularly damning. So what they're saying is that the cigarette butt found in one of the men's graves, they applied a little-known technique in typing dried blood to bodily fluids other than blood, like saliva. Have you heard that? Is that?
I did this work, very early on in my career, the ABO testing and like for blood bank aspects, you can go ahead and do your ABO testing directly from the blood. But when you start dealing with dried stains, you now have to do different techniques. And if it's a blood stain, we would do what's called an absorption elution technique in order to be able to determine the ABO type. Something like with semen, we would have to go to an absorption inhibition. So it's, without going into details, and quite frankly, I'm not sure I could get into the details because it's very esoteric. It's been too long since I've been there, but it's somewhat of an indirect way of determining the ABO type of a person who secretes their ABO substance into their semen or their saliva. So this technique, it was evolving in the 1970s. I was doing it in 1994, so it was a little bit more mature when I was doing it versus, the forensic scientists who were doing it back in the day. And, quite frankly, the training program, the competency aspect of what they were doing, I tell agencies today, that have cases from this era, I say, you absolutely just throw out the old, what we would call conventional serology testing. Don't worry about what they found on their ABO testing, whatever technique they used, or secretostatus aspect. Just use modern DNA if you still have evidence.
Yeah. Well, listen to what Dr. Ruth Guy says, and you tell me what you think. So they have established that this is the technique they're going to use. She said she was able to determine the ABO blood type of the smoker who they presumed is the killer, which I don't know if that's a gimme or not. It was a butt that was found in the grave, but what if he used dirt that had the butt already in it? I don't know.
Right.
So they say she testified that she was able to determine the ABO blood type of the smoker if they were among 78% of the population known as secretors. So the cigarette was smoked by someone who had an O-type blood, and neither the person who was in the grave or Juan Corona had O. They were both A. And there was blood on the gun barrel. The blood on the gun barrel was type O, and the guy who was shot was a type A. So they're coming up with these things, and none of it points to Juan Corona.
As I just mentioned, I don't put any weight on that ABO testing at all. And when you start talking about type O, I mean, that throws in a whole other can of worms in terms of interpreting these types of results. I mean, it sounds like with things being mislabeled, things being lost, you have CSIs in over their head. This is an unusual case. I mean, think about the number of grave sites, the number of bodies that they're finding in rapid order. I've never worked a case like that, and I've got more experience than most, across the nation in terms of big cases and complex cases. And then you think about a smaller agency, and often Yuba is serviced by California DOJ. So that's the laboratory system it's a statewide laboratory system that Yuba would be using. And the California DOJ has criminalists and very experienced criminalists that go out to help these smaller agencies. So part of my assessment on what went wrong in terms of the evidence in this case, did they pull in the state level criminalists on this, or were they relying on Yuba Sheriff CSIs or Yuba City CSIs, the small county, small town, and they're in over their heads. But even if you bring in the state, you're kind of inventing as you go along, so you could be very experienced. Doesn't necessarily excuse some of the mislabeling or loss of evidence, that shouldn't happen. I think right now, this is where trying to assess the prosecution's case, it's getting to where they were dealing with what they had back in the 1970s. And to present to a jury, this innovative ABO testing off of saliva from cigarette butts that I will tell you, probably was not adequately validated compared to how scientific methodologies in forensic labs are validated today. I just put no weight on it, and secretor status, Golden State Killer. I went to the very first task force meeting back in 2011 when we reconvened down in Santa Barbara. And I told them all these guys that were eliminated based on secretor status back in the 1970s, throw it out. Let's track them down again and get a sample that we can do modern DNA on. So that's what's, kind of catching my attention. I mean, I think there's no question that Juan Corona is the killer in this case. It's now, okay, what did the investigative aspect do right? What did they do wrong? How strong was the people's case against Juan Corona, and how did the defense, attack that case, that strategy? What was the defense's strategy?
Okay, here we go. The prosecutor cannot give a motive. So he closes by basically saying that a team of 10 psychiatrists could work years on a man who has done something just like this and still not come up with the answer. We know juries love hearing shit like that. We don't know what happened.
Yeah, but I want to point out that, I mean, at the time of this case, the term serial killer had never been used, right? So this is where, they had the term lust killer, going back at least to the 1950s, where, investigators understood that there was a type of predator out there that was sexually motivated. But now in this particular case where, I mean, it's obvious to me, but for them, they couldn't go after the evidence. Let's say you have these men whose genitalia are exposed and everything else. It'd be a simple collection technique and doing DNA and showing, there was sexual interaction between Juan Corona and this victim. But they didn't have that, and they didn't understand truly what the serial predator was until you had, the FBI's, this is the John Douglas, Bob Ressler, Dr. Ann Burgess, and I've got all their books behind me. This is where authorities just really didn't understand the serial predator in the early 1970s. And so for a prosecutor to say, well, we don't know what the motive is, it's obvious what the motive is. There's a sexual component, there's a fantasy component, and there may have been a mission-oriented component with Juan Corona.
Well, let me tell you, the defense really goes after Juan Corona's brother.
Okay.
So this is a switch up here. So, Natividad was the one who turned in or tipped, police off, tipped the sheriff off that his brother had just attacked this man terribly in his cafe a year earlier. So here's what the defense says.
And this is a smart strategy.
The number one thing is they said this prosecutor has no idea what he's doing. They're incompetent. Wow. And, there were some witnesses who said some of these men were definitely getting into Juan Corona's truck, except the witnesses were off with the color. And he had a couple of different kinds of vehicles. So, they meticulously went through each witness and essentially discredited what the witnesses said. And of course, the fingertip mix-ups and everything else. But here's the big thing. The new information that they had not heard yet was that they are taking the suspicion off of Juan and putting it on Natividad. So Hawk says in his opening statement that on the stand will be a woman who's an expert in homosexuality. Evelyn Hooker is her name. And he says in his opening statement, this expert will tell you there is nothing, the ultimate act of humiliation, degradation to a Mexican man, the ultimate act of losing his machismo is to play the role of the female in a sexual encounter. She will tell you that these men are driven by masochistic tendencies, either to have pain inflicted upon them or be degraded, that underneath all of this masochistic tendency is a boiling, bellowing rage, and that it is not uncommon for all of the passivo homosexual to suddenly turn in a homicidal rage to destroy or mutilate the man that he has just had intercourse with. And then he says, in what is I'm sure to be a classic line, the same expert will also tell you that Juan Corona is hopelessly heterosexual. Now, the question is, we're pretty certain that Juan Corona is responsible for this. Is he setting his brother up? Or is there something like what we've been talking about, a very, conscious or subconscious element of sexual whatever about Juan Corona? So on which one is it?
First, everything that this Dr. Hooker, Evelyn Hooker, when you take the totality of the series and what's going on, that just does not line up with what we know today as the predator. There's, questions that I would have that, I know we don't have answers to. However, when I think about all the details that I can recollect that you've told me, this completely falls in line with a predator that is actively seeking out victims of a certain type and is sexually interacting with them at some level that we don't know what that level is because they didn't collect the evidence and didn't document appropriately for what today's standards would be. To say that Juan Corona is heterosexual and to make a defense that, well, therefore he's not responsible for this sexual humiliation of these, white men victims. I mean, that's, from my perspective, that's ludicrous. Basically, you have a predator that is seeking self-gratification. That self-gratification includes a sexual component. It includes the violence component. It includes the idea of being able to get away with these crimes, committing these crimes, on locations that the predator has familiarity with. Juan Corona has an anchor point in these orchards from a geographic profiling standpoint. He's choosing victims that he knows he can victimize and kill, and nobody's going to basically report anybody missing. No loved ones are out there because of these, the transient nature of who these victims are. I mean, he's just showing all the classic characteristics of an organized offender. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think he's mixed. There's some disorganized aspects to him, but he is out there committing crimes for self-gratification and wants to continue to commit these crimes.
Well, here's what's interesting to me about the defense. They don't go down the mental incompetence road, the mental illness road, because, Hawk believes, the defense attorney believes that, this obviously is admitting that he did something wrong. So he thought this is a more viable defense. So what he says, I'm going to try to shorthand this. So Hawk essentially says, accuses Natividad Corona of just about everything under the sun. And I don't know what's verified and what's not. I do know that he was a member of the Guadalajara police in the 50s, but he was dismissed for fraud and homosexuality. And in 1968, he had contracted syphilis. And these charges followed Natividad to the cafe that he owned, because there was an anonymous writer to the Alcohol Beverage Commission that said that Natividad will corrupt any minor who enters this restaurant. He sweet talks them and gets them drunk. And in 1971, that year, he was accused by the Jalisco police of kidnapping and possibly murdering a young boy. And this is creative. The defense says that Natividad is the one who killed all of these people when he was in a rage caused by the syphilis that he had. So this is what they're trying to do. They're saying Juan Corona is a family man. He's got a wife and 4 daughters. He goes to church every week. He's a good boss, according to everybody. Now, here's one issue, Paul. Jose, the man who was almost killed, right, by Juan, he changes his story, I have no idea, multiple times. He actually says that Natividad was his attacker in 1970. It wasn't his brother Juan. And just as Natividad had tried to frame, his brother The defense said he was happy to have him take the fall again. And so this is all Natividad's doing.
Well, I think it's interesting, and this is where, today we could answer this question.
Yeah.
So Natividad, it's very possible that he has committed, some violent acts against males, maybe young males. And, his half brother, Juan, is also committing homicidal acts against men. Criminality does seem to run in families. We've seen this over and over and over again. Any law enforcement agency, you go into them and say, okay, who's responsible for a majority of your crimes in your city? And you'll see they'll point out select families and go, this family is the biggest pain in the ass in this jurisdiction. And it's the grandfather, it's the father, it's the son, it's the grandkid. They're all committing crimes. So I'm, in terms of Natividad having a criminal past, it does not give me any pause about, Juan's involvement in the crimes that he's been charged with. And now you think about, okay, let's do a little bit of offender profiling. Does Natividad have the same connections to the orchards that Juan has? Does Natividad have the same connection to the victims that Juan has? All the bloody weapons and everything else, who had possession of those? Was it in Natividad's possession? Was it Juan's possession? Did Natividad have access to Juan's, wherever these weapons were located at? So I think as we go down and try to evaluate all the cases between these two relatives, Natividad and Juan, things seem to stack up on Juan and not on Natividad. Yeah. Now, maybe there's an argument that Natividad, being maybe a very organized, intelligent offender, is over time constantly trying to set up Juan, and is doing everything he can to have the case go against Juan. It just doesn't seem like that would be the situation. I think the defense was smart to point fingers at Natividad because that is going to cause the jury to go, huh. And who knows about, the attack in Natividad's restaurant. Maybe Natividad did that attack. But it doesn't, negate, Juan's association with these other homicide cases out in the orchards.
And think about what's actually documented, which is Juan going to a mental health facility years earlier. I mean, it's not like Natividad put him in 69 or even 70. This was, I think it was 53, so long ago, for delusional thoughts and then acting out violently. And that's documented. He is in this facility. So there are records that show that.
It certainly is showing, Juan's past, but you still have to prove the case. These murder charges. I mean, these cases you have to have the evidence that is contemporaneous with each of those cases. You can't say, well, this guy was in a mental health facility 15 years ago, so therefore he's responsible for these murders. You have to have the evidence for those murders in order to prove the case. Now, maybe during sentencing, the jury would hear about Juan's past, both pros and cons in terms of why his sentence should be longer or shorter, depending on prosecution versus defense. And that's just where, right now, I'm not doubting Juan's involvement in the homicides. But if there is any controversy over that, and, I don't know if there is or not, if they still have the evidence, I think it would be easy to prove with modern technology.
There didn't appear to be controversy in 1972 when he went on trial because he was convicted on all 25 counts.
Okay.
Not quite case closed because of something I mentioned earlier. Just so we know, Hawk, the defense attorney, was really annoying to me. And he was good to know he was sentenced to 6 months in jail, I guess it would be prison. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail in 1973, a year later for tax evasion. So there you go.
I know that name Richard Hawk, and I'm not sure it's because of the Corona case or if there's something else that he got involved with. But that Richard Hawk sounds familiar to me. He
said later on, I only took the case because I wanted to be famous. Great. It's just what you want in a defense attorney. So there are appeals that happen. And in 1978, California Appeals Court says that Richard Hawk gave him an incompetent defense because they said, what about the insanity defense? What about mental, incompetency? And they said that Hawk made a big mistake. And of course, Hawk said, well, you got to pick your horse and ride it. And so this is what the appeal court says. The trial counsel for appellant failed to raise the obvious alternative defenses of mental incompetence and diminished capacity or legal insanity. Still worse, the trial counsel failed to present any meaningful defense at all. After a lengthy trial lasting several months in which the prosecutor produced more than 100 lay and expert witnesses and put an immense amount of wealth of documentary evidence forward, the defense counsel failed to call a single witness on his client's behalf and submitted the case basically upon the evidence produced by the prosecution.
Yeah.
I don't know. He shot his shot.
All he did was cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, maybe there is a valid incompetence, for Juan Corona, in terms of the initial trial. Did he get retried? Was it remanded?
Well, listen to this. So, yes, he was going to get a retrial. In the interim, he has a heart attack in prison, and he is stabbed 32 times by inmates at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He loses sight in one eye, survives it, obviously. He allegedly confesses to 3 murders, not of transient workers, and then recants. And then he does go on trial. In 1982, there's a second trial in Hayward, California. The defense does not argue mental incompetence. They, again, do the same thing. And this isn't Hawk this time. They say that Natividad, who is dead at this point, has carried out the killings in a rage related to his homosexuality. At least we're past the syphilis part. And this time Juan takes the stand. He claims his innocence, 25 concurrent life sentences, and he dies in 2019. It's not very long ago.
No.
I mean, 8 years ago.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Well, the CMF Vacaville was my rear neighbor for part of my life.
Well, he was there, Paul.
Well, so was Ed Kemper. So was Charles Manson.
Oh, my gosh.
This was sort of the clearinghouse for anybody that potentially had some mental issues. I mean, you have many of these serial killers initially went to CMF Vacaville to be evaluated before they ended up being distributed into the prison system that was appropriate for their housing. So, Juan Corona would have been my rear neighbor for, part of my life for sure. I think it would be interesting, to evaluate the physical evidence today with modern technology, just to see, what's going on. I really don't have any questions that Juan Corona, about Juan Corona and his involvement in these 25 cases. Natividad, I think, is potentially just being used as a scapegoat. And he may have his own criminal history that could include significant violence. But, I'm not seeing how Natividad could, set Juan up, at the level of, whether you call it circumstantial or not. It's a pretty significant case against Juan Corona. And I think I'm pretty satisfied that the right guy was serving time for these 25 murders.
So he was in for more than 46 years.
Yeah.
So, sometimes I think, okay, what do we take away from this case? And I actually am not quite sure, except the constant reminder to me that there are people who fall through the cracks. There are an awful lot of people. Like, I didn't even tell you this. One of the victims, his wife was notified Your ex-husband's dead. What do we do with the body? And she said, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that I think was a very common theme, with the exception of maybe one or two of these men, 25 people. And then Jose, I don't know what Jose's thinking, flipping. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe Natividad, is a suspect in that. I don't know.
Well, I think with Jose, you think about traumatic brain injury, TBI. In terms of memory, recall, individuals that suffer that, it's difficult to put a lot of veracity on their memory because it's been shown. They completely have amnesia. They go, I last remember, let's say with Jose, I last remember opening the bathroom door, and then, attacked, a minute later or 2 minutes later, he has no memory because of the traumatic brain injury. So it's kind of tough to say, okay, he changed the story and now it's Natividad that it's his attacker. Mm-hmm. I don't think I would, put a lot of weight on that. My takeaway, and it really, I think you're right, is, you think about this, you have 25 men, this is where, most of the cases that I've dealt with involving serial predators are women and children. Mm. And now you do see where you do have a vulnerable male victim, this transient population that Juan Corona was able to take advantage of. Mm-hmm. And he was able to kill a lot of men. And I don't know exactly the time span, but it's within a year or 2 years, in terms of those cases that are ending up in the orchard. Who knows what other cases he was involved with. Yeah. So it doesn't matter who you are in terms of your own characteristics. You can become a victim if a predator targets you, and you just have to be aware of that and take steps to try to avoid, making yourself vulnerable.
And as a subset of that, I would say I'm thrilled that the alternate suspect, Natividad, and his homosexuality seemed to play no part in two different trials, where it absolutely could have in the 70s. And 1982. So at least that didn't work. But yeah, this case, I know you like serial killer cases, and they're not for entertainment for me. It is for figuring these kinds of things out. How do you get away with something? What are we doing as a society to fail people so that there is somebody who can come as a predator and take advantage of these people?
Yeah, no, and that's just it. There is, what's that term? White soft underbelly, if you will, that predators can focus in on, and nobody pays attention. And the reality is since the 1970s, with all the security changes and technology advancements, it's a lot harder for offenders to go after victims that have strong associations within society, whether it be with family or they work or whatever else. And I always say predators go to where the prey's at. And where's the prey? It's the prey. The prey is those people that if something happens to them, nobody notices.
Well, next week, let's see what ends up happening. It'll be, I'm sure, a very different case. But and hopefully we'll be going back. I need to go backwards a little bit, I think. Take a break from the 70s. This is a lot of 70s for me. But next week we'll have something totally new. So I'm looking forward to it, Paul Holes.
As always, Kate, thank you very much for this.